Dobro večer, good evening, guten Abend allerseits. Thank you very much. Three men in a boat. We are being joined, as always, by Jason J. Smart, editor-at-large and grand publicist of the Kiev Post, and a friend of ours who's been with us at Maria Report for many, many times already, Konrad Schuller. Konrad has been since 1992 with the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung in various, locations, has been reporting on Poland and Ukraine for a very long time, has significant know-how, both, due to his upbringing where he was born in Central Eastern Europe, and understands the German political scene and its procrastination tendencies better than many people. So on this very Tuesday, the 25th, on this, second day after the election hangover of various parties, we thought we'll talk about why the election came to be in its form, what happened in the election, and what kind of impact it has going forward, and what the rest of the world and Ukraine can hope to achieve together with, hopefully, a slightly more leadership-prone Germany. But there you go. Konrad, what do you think?
Maybe I go straight into
verbatim
into what is particularly interesting for us. What will this happen? What will this mean? This outcome mean for Ukraine and Russia? The resistance against Russia's aggression. And I think there are a couple of good news and a couple of bad news after Sunday's election. I start maybe with the bad news. The bad news is that two pro-Russian Putinist parties have grown significantly. The right-wing AfD, Alternative für Deutschland, Alternative for Germany, has doubled its vote to 20%. The party called Die Linke, the left, has increased to about 8%. And another party, which has newly been created, Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht, has grown to almost 5%, which was not enough to send anybody to the German parliament, to the Bundestag, because of the 5% threshold we have in Germany. But taking all these parties together, we have almost a third of the German electorate who voted for either openly Putinist or, let's say, illusionary pacifist parties. Another bad news is that Ukraine's staunchest ally in the German political system, and those who are have been most outspoken against Russian aggression, the Greens, have suffered moderate losses, but the consequence is that they are probably not going to be part of the governing coalition again. These were the bad news. The good news is who is out. We have a chancellor who was who had never managed to say the word "we want Ukraine to win." He was the one who always hid behind Biden, who never was ready to take responsibility, that responsibility that Germany should have as the largest European economy and the most populous country. Germany never took that lead. He always hid behind the formula, we are the second biggest donor to Ukraine, which is true, but it's a banality. Germany is by far the second biggest country in NATO, and if you take the German aid to Ukraine by as compared to the GDP, we have always been at something like position 12 or 13 or 15. So he's gone. Chancellor Scholz is gone. probably in his party, those who were the representatives of the 20th century pacifist ideas, like Rolf Mützenich, who was the club leader in the Bundestag, also announced his withdrawal.
But Miss Esken is still there, right? I mean, one of the leaders of the party is still there.
But I don't expect her to become one of the key personalities in the Social Democratic Party. So in the Social Democratic Party, I think the more realistic part is going to define the line, which is the Minister of Defense Pistorius, who is the most popular politician of Germany, and the head of the party, Klingbeil, who I have some criticism against him, but he's less bad than others in that party. And then, of course, we have the probable next chancellor. He is, by his upbringing, an Atlanticist, close ties to America, to what used to be America, to make it more precise. He has early advocated a more staunch support for Ukraine, amongst others, the delivery of Taurus cruise missiles. We have to say there is a tendency in his party, especially in the eastern part, the former East Germany, former communist East Germany, who for complicated reasons follow Putinist narratives, also in Merz, in the Christian Democratic Party of Merz. So we will probably not be free to a full U-turn. But I think
they also lost, right? Those exponents in the Christian Democratic Union in those 5 states have actually lost in terms of weight because they lost their elections.
Yes, they lost, but they lost to the bigger evil, to the openly Putinist left and right-wing extremists. So in his party, it will probably not be possible to make the full U-turn, but we will have, let's say, a gradually more realistic approach to Russia and to the idea that Russia needs force to be compelled to stop its aggression against Ukraine, and not the idle hope for the result of negotiations without any chips on the table. So,
colleagues, Konrad, just for the purpose and for the benefit of Jason, who's been reading upon this during the day, and I sent him a couple of snippets. Your colleagues, Kohler, Braunberger, and the likes, all literally have argued, and I think you're trending towards this as well, but maybe you can enlighten the audience a bit, that this is pretty much the last chance of the centrist parties in Germany to actually make the necessary changes which large parts of the population have expected and have not seen.
Yeah, this is the electorate in Germany has a couple of central topics, which I think it's 3 of them. One is war and peace, one is migration, or one is the economy. And there is a growing consensus in Germany that we have to change our approach to migration. It is terribly difficult for many reasons, because the whole European system of migration doesn't work. But the impression of large parts of the electorate that migration has come out of control was nourishing the extreme left and the extreme right.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, we have to get this under control, and you can also in my editor amongst my colleagues in Ep6, we don't all agree on everything here. So for example, I think that it was a mistake by Friedrich-Merz to accept the support of the extreme right wing when it came to proposing marginal changes in immigration policy. Others of my colleagues will say, yes, he was right to do so.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, this problem needs to be solved at the moment. And I think all over the political spectrum in Germany, people are starting to rethink, even amongst those who would have tended to be ultra-liberal or I say ultra-welcoming. We called it in Germany the Willkommenskultur, the welcoming culture. Those who basically have open hearts understand that we have restricted possibilities. As one of our presidents said, we have open hearts, but our possibilities are restricted.
There's a dichotomy in this, isn't there? Because Jason and I have been talking about this a few times, that essentially the Russian authoritarian approach and the Russian approach to seeding chaos in Europe was definitely vested in how they created a migration crisis coming out of Syria. They've tried this in smaller efforts through Belarus. Yes, but sorry.
They bombed Aleppo, and the refugees from Aleppo arrived in Europe.
Yeah.
And they bombed Ukraine, and people from Ukraine arrived in Europe.
Yeah, but that's the thing. That's the dichotomy. That the Ukrainians arrive in Europe is no surprise, because there's an active war on European soil and the Europeans have to take them in. The Syrians, and this is the specific thing about the Russians, they did understand that the Greeks and the Italians couldn't defend their borders. But they also understood that Germany would be the backstop, and then Germany would, with its cultural perception vested in the post-war developments and how we approach people who seek political asylum for many good reasons, that we would be more vulnerable, but economically that we would be the backstop, and that Miss Merkel would react this way. And they exploited it. And we let us be exploited. That's the difficulty about it. Even if you want to take it, I mean, people who come as refugees running away from war, everybody as a human being understands why. But the problem is, we didn't actually deter the prior action. We did nothing when the Russians fomented the war in Syria. I think, Jason, that has always been our argument, that we did nothing vis-a-vis Russian actions in Ukraine, and we did very little, if anything, in Syria.
Absolutely the case. Russia's realized that it has a free hand to do what it pleases. It realizes that there's too much fear in the US as well as Europe to respond with force. And so for year after year, they kept attacking and destroying Syria. It's for more than a decade been a waging war against Ukraine. And this is just something that they realize they could get away with. But more than that is the militarization of refugees. So when you look at it as a strategic plan, you remember right before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, when there was just masses of refugees showing up via Belarus to the Polish border, to the Lithuanian border. We saw, obviously, the case that you cited of the incredible sums of refugees from Syria coming to Europe. But, the same thing happens in the U.S. Prior to the U.S. elections, there was a massive surge of people, migrants, showing up at the border who came specifically from 3 countries at a higher rate than ever before. And it was Nicaragua, Cuba, and Venezuela. And Venezuela, of course, is leading that. Now, if you look at that, you say, well, that's very funny. I wonder why they all show up right before an election. And the reason is simple, because that only further increases the amount of nationalism of the population. And that's something that translates well for pro-Russian leaders who make xenophobia and make immigration the big issue in their elections. This is all helpful for Russia. But Russia is not only complicit in this, it's actively organizing this. And it's actually, I think, sort of amazing, something that's rarely talked about, is Russia's role. We always talk about Ukraine for very obvious reasons. But if we look more globally, Russia is engaged not just in the militarization of refugees and migrants, but it cooperates with others who make that migration necessary, such as the Assad regime. But let's look a bit deeper at the non-state actors, not the state actors, the non-state actors. Latin America, the reason that, for instance, there's been a huge surge of immigration from Ecuador is specifically due to the drug trafficking. But we know that the drug traffickers and the drug cartels have connections to Iran, as well as to Hezbollah, as well as to Russia. So there's all this goes full circle. I mean, the problem is being caused by what and by whom, I should say. And as a result, though, we have a problem arise called immigration. But it's actually Russia's nefarious roots.
May I just add Africa to this equation?
Yes.
Look at the Sahel, Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, where also it's Russian activity that encourages migration movements to the north and boat people landing in Greece and Italy at the end of the day. So that's the activities of Russia in Libya.
Obviously.
So yes, that makes a pattern, of course.
Oh, it's definitely a pattern. And if you look at the case of Nigeria, Burkina Faso, and Mali, and you can see, one, Russia overthrew the governments in those countries or assisted those who overthrew the governments. But then you look at what happens next, migration. This is something that is not just a once or twice happen. This is something that routinely happens. This is an instrument of war for Russia. But it's actually, I think, one of the elements of Russia's new warfare against us that is the most interesting. As I've argued before, I think it's totally unrealistic that Russia would launch a war against NATO in a conventional sense. But I do believe they are actively waging a war in their own eyes against NATO and its allies using non-conventional means. And this sort of a thing, like we see now, it's not just, we usually talk about propaganda and disinformation, which definitely has a huge value. But look at the recent elections in Europe. Look in the case of Romania, where they did disturb the elections. We look at the case of Moldova, where they got very close, but they didn't succeed. But in Georgia, they did succeed. So Russia is quite nefarious, and it's able to realize, and it's a very accurate decision, it's much cheaper or much more of a sure result to try to interfere in other countries' elections or to send migrants that disturbs the political climate than it is to actually physically invade a country. That's a huge risk, and it's probably not worth it. But this, much better.
Let me ask you something. This, I would agree. I would have agreed to this analysis a couple of months before, that Russia would not dare to start a conventional war against NATO territory. That was before I saw all the things people in Washington has said and done in the last couple of weeks. What I heard at the Munich Security Conference made me think that my assumption, which was similar to yours, that Russia would never start an outright war with NATO, but try other ways, like enhancing migration. Maybe that is gone. That idea that they would not dare it. Maybe we have to calculate in a new way.
Jason, please respond. But I have a view on this, and I would like to share it with you both. But please, Jason.
So my hypothesis is a little bit different, and I don't mean to be long-winded, but I'll explain it as shortly as possible, is that I believe that in the eyes of Vladimir Putin, we're not going to head for World War III because he believes we're already in World War IV. In the eyes of Vladimir Putin, World War III was the Cold War, which they consider to be a legitimate war. Keep in mind, we think of wars usually in the conventional sense, such as World War II. You imagine massive fleets fighting with each other out in the Pacific. You imagine entire countries being seized with hundreds of thousands of soldiers at Stalingrad. But that's really unrealistic. In modern warfare, that doesn't work. Russia has not invested since the 60s, 70s. They realized they sort of lose the ability to compete in that type of warfare in the way that they would need to with the West. For you, ask yourself a question. Why do they have the Black Sea Fleet? The Black Sea Fleet's not a threat to the United States. It's not a threat to NATO. But it is a threat to Georgia. It is a threat to the countries that are in the region. And that's what they keep it around for. It's to have regional hegemony. But why go back to the World War IV thing and why that's so important? is that ultimately Russia is engaging in warfare. And we know that because we see all the external signs of it. We see the fact that they are toppling regimes in other countries as they did in the Cold War. We see that they are aligning themselves with the state actors are obvious: Iran, North Korea, China, Venezuela, etc. But the non-state actors are the ones that are more interesting, I think. So remember that Hamas went to Moscow only a couple days after the October 7th attacks in Israel. That wasn't by coincidence. Russia was very happy to stand there and post photos with them. But you look at the relationship of where the money came from leading up to that attack. And sure enough, there's a lot of ties to Russia. We look at the amount of money that was being taken from specifically, actually, Lebanon, not from Lebanon, from various Arab countries and transported to Latin America, where specifically in Venezuela is where they've been doing a lot of transactions. But where's Venezuela? How's that work out? Because all these countries are tied together. The drug cartels have a problem. They have tons and tons of cash. Russia doesn't have access to cash, as Iran doesn't have access to cash because they're sanctioned nations. Drug cartels, like terrorist organizations, need cash. So there's actually a very good deal they can do. We can trade you the cash for bank transfers, and that's why Russian banks are used to launder drug money. But besides that, going back to if they'd start an actual war with Europe or the United States, no, I think that it's absolutely in their interest that we invest as much money as we can in military technologies and we ignore where the actual warfare is. What did Sun Tzu say? Sun Tzu said the art of war is that the real objective is that you can subdue your enemy before firing a shot, before actually going to combat. In this case, that's what you're doing. You're having the United States, Europe, spend incredible sums of money for their own domestic defense, for actual military hardware. But they spend very, very, very little to combat Russia, where we see they've been the most effective. Russia's chosen the battlefield for this war. And I see that in the case of elections. We see in the case of illegal immigration. We see it in the case of drugs. We see it in the case of how the public has become more radicalized in all these countries. Look at the percent of Americans today who believe conspiracy theories. And look at how many of those conspiracy theories have ties to Russia. It's incredible sums. So if you're going to actually win a war, that's much cheaper and much more effective than it is to go take over a piece of land. It doesn't really accomplish very much for you. I think it's much more strategically wise, and I think they are being strategically wise, to wage war against us where we're not prepared for it. People at the Pentagon prepare for World War III thinking of World War II. They're already past that, and we see that they have not invested in their military at the rate that they needed to, and they still continue not to, even though people say, oh, but 28% more spending. Yeah, but their inflationary rates right now about 27%. It's not a huge deal that they've increased it. The reality is that Russia is not preparing for that. There's no evidence for that I see. But there is significant evidence that they've increased their expenditures year upon year, even now, on how much they're doing to manipulate elections in foreign countries.
The key 3 points Konrad mentioned are reflected in the approach the Russians have taken. And they still do this because it works. The exploitation of the issues of open societies dealing with migration, meaning people coming in who are neither affiliated with the local culture, cannot easily integrate, fail to have necessarily all the skills, as well as have no connection to the, pay-in scheme of the European pension systems, very important factor of migration in this case, unfortunately for Europe. And the lack of capital markets capability and flexibility to adapt that, and therefore they cannot soak up migrants as easily as, for example, America did this in 3-4 different phases since industrialization. Europe cannot deal with migration as easily, and therefore they exploit it. It matters a great deal. The fear of war, and the discussion of war and peace, as Konrad said, the fear of war in Europe matters a great deal because it can still now be conjured up. People elongated the effects of the fear of war, which has been waged across Central Eastern Europe and into the certain parts of Germany in the Second World War. They have constantly regurgitated the effects and the impacts on every anniversary of the 2 large wars, meaning the Great War and then the Second World War, as they were called, has been used for that purpose. Even the projection of what is essentially dealing with genocide of the Holocaust has constantly been used by the Russians and every extremist faction in the media to project guilt, project fear, or utilize ressentiments, resentment in society, and push it. This is what they do. This is what they need to do. And it's easier to do with a lot of money than buying hardware. So, Jason, I completely agree with you. But then again, complaining about this, we should just people remind what Bezmenov and others have told us in the 1980s, that the cultural disintegration and the creation of fear to dissect and make less adhesive the glue of Western society was the key aspect, the key pursuit of Russian propaganda and disinformatia. And they have pursued this meticulously. It's the only thing they've actually succeeded in, and they've managed to still keep up that fear. Now, this fear works, and when Konrad says, okay, well, a few weeks ago, he would not have considered that Russia could actually engage in conventional war, let me go back to the facts. If you look to what General Petraeus just said in Kiev last week, what Ben Hodges has been highlighting, what in a few years ago, the Crystal stated, Breedlove, and what more importantly, nowadays, those who are close to the armed forces, let's take our friends in Finland, highlight the Russian capability to invade areas which they don't need because there's no natural resources and no specific strategic and tactical aims they have to go for, like in Ukraine, where they need the space. They believe that they need the space, and they need Sevastopol. They need Crimea for their strategic position in the Black Sea. Fighting there conventionally, whilst we are unprepared and unwilling to fight, is still worthwhile doing from their perspective. It is not worthwhile doing because they can see it now that they're actually hollowed out, as Jason has been arguing for a long time. Economically, they're hollowed out. The key aspect is there's nothing to win in a war dealing with the Baltics or Finland for that matter, even if you want it. Even if you have this belief, as often projected by people surrounding Botnikov and Patrushev, that they would do that they would want it and that it's important for them, it makes no sense. The Finns will beat the shit out of, let's do this a little bit before, the Finns will very happily and very meticulously not only resist, but thwart any kind of approach. They have the better army. They have the better defense concept. The Baltics are reasonably well set up to be defended by a combination of those NATO nations which are actually responsible. Estonia, the UK, Latvia, Canada, Lithuania, Germany, plus all the others engaged in the area. The Americans have very few troops, 500 in Estonia, 300 in Latvia, 300 and something in Lithuania. That's nothing. They are important. They're good people, highly respected, no question. They're important for logistics, for intelligence, for integration, and even sensor technology. However, can the region deal and defend itself? Yes. Can the Poles do it? Yes. Are the Romanians capable? I believe so. Would Hungary and Slovakia be a sensible inroad? Sure, they may try, but we'll cut them off. Conventionally, there is no way to fight this war without Russia collapsing completely. So as such, this is not the way forward for them. But exploiting that fear of war and us having to invest excessively, we have to invest massively, no question, and we will. But investing in technology which they can take out makes very little sense. The Royal Navy should be built out because naval forces are significantly more versatile and movable. We should deal with the asymmetric effects of their asymmetric warfare against communication cables and the likes. We don't do that at the moment. So, Jason, from my point of view, you're absolutely right. And the last part, and that comes back to why it matters what happens in Germany, is economics. The only nation in Europe which can actually make hay from defense spending currently and save its economic model to tide it over for 3 to 5 years is Germany. Because it has the factory combinations and the factory manufacturing capabilities still there, underutilized because of its specific energy bias in phasing out its automobile industry. So technically, Germany can actually do something good with that. That's the only thing they can do at the moment, which has an immediate effect. If you ever wanted state investment, and I'm not a Keynesian, as you know, but if you ever wanted state investment to matter a great deal, this is the time. There you have it. Your 3 points. Completely with you, Konrad. And I think Jason is right. We should not be drawn into that momentum that we overinvest, that we should focus on what happened in the past. We should look to the future because the Russians have none. They have no technology and they can't build it.
I'm still not convinced that the last couple of weeks have not brought a fundamental change in our security arrangements. When I heard J.D. Vance saying at the security conference in Munich that the greater hazard to Europe's freedom is not Russia or China, but Europe itself. And when we talk about defending freedom, we should first agree amongst each other as allies what freedom is, what we actually are defending. This sounded like a divorce. This sounded like a divorce. And we have. When I heard that, I said, "This is the end of Article 5." This sounds like the end of Article 5. So you say the Finns would happily beat the shit out of the Russians. The Estonians would happily do so. Would they? Would the Estonians?
Yes.
Would they? Yeah. So
they would fight, no question. We had, by the way, to our Estonian listeners and viewers, head Eesti Vabariigi aastapäevad, meaning Happy Independence Day, which we had yesterday. They would fight.
Let me play the devil's advocate. Would Trump credibly trade Boston for Riga?
Oh, no, he wouldn't. But he doesn't have to. But the Swedes, Danes, and Norwegians, and I think even Germans, and definitely Finns would not trade it at all. That's my point. I think this is where you should take into account what is conventional force-wise available, and that the Europeans in the Nordics, this is why the JEF, for example, as pushed by the UK, last time when Heapy and chaps were still in charge of the armed forces, at least that they managed to get through the stupid bureaucracy in Whitehall, that they get the JEF funded at least. The interconnectivity between the forces and what Ben Hodges once created with the NFIUs, the NATO Force Integration Units, has led to significantly deeper fabric and better fabric between the, say, Western forces here in the region. You can see this in Ukraine as well. The Americans, and Jason knows this very well, the Americans, Canadians, also some French, but very few, the Swedes and the Brits were here since end of 2014, and they worked extremely closely with the Ukrainian armed forces. Otherwise, the changes from what was beforehand a dominantly, may I say, still relatively Soviet structure would never have happened. But the fabric happens on the NCO and officer level, and this has happened in NATO, and therefore I think the military is ready to fight, and the populations here in the region would fight.
Don't take it as defeatism. I think we are underestimating the problem. Look at the end of 2022, when we had the situation that American services were estimated that Russia was close to the use of tactical nuclear weapons. And it was only, as far as I understand that situation, and that contradict me if I'm wrong, as far as I understand that situation, at the end of 2022, Ukraine was advancing, Russia was losing, and American services informed the president they estimated Putin was pondering the use of nuclear weapons, and it was only some tough talking by, I think, Mr. Bolton to his Russian counterpart that might have caused Putin to change his mind. So we will not have that anymore. I don't believe that we have that anymore. I'm not advocating defeatism, but just having a sober look at what it means not to have that as a backing if such a situation occurs, which seems to have occurred at the end of 2022.
Jason, Sullivan and his friend, his chap, who has constantly bothered him in 14 meetings recorded, 24 generally to the White House. Charab has really been a bad apple in that regard. But maybe you can tell us a bit more. What do you think really happened at the end of 2022 with Mr. Sullivan and his level of fear?
I mean, I think that it's very important to understand what was the objective of the White House, right? So if we're trying to understand actions, we should probably understand what the motivation was first. We know in the case for the administration of Biden, there was a couple of things that were really, really important. Avoiding World War III is something he said multiple times. He said avoiding nuclear war multiple times. Another one was that there would be no boots on the ground from the Americans in Ukraine. That was another thing that was very key. It's totally absurd how that's worked out as a policy, but whatever. These are three things that Sullivan said from the very beginning would not change, and sure enough, they never changed in the whole length of the war. They were so overcome by fear, though, of the Russians. And keep in mind, the Russians weren't considering using a massive nuclear weapon like a Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We're talking about something that would have a small radius. It was assumed by the Americans that they would not attack where people were, that is, Ukrainian civilians or soldiers. Rather, it would be demonstrative, like done in an area where there's nobody, or forced. Why? So it has the impact necessary, the fear factor necessary, and that's all it would seek to achieve. Also, then, Russia could always have plausible deniability if they do it somewhere like near a power station, right? So then they could say, well, so they blew up, we don't know it was us, we don't know it was that. But there was never an idea that they would nuke Kiev. That was never going to happen. And realistically, Russia has a lot more to lose on that than to gain. I've asked a few different generals who have worked on European policy before for the United States, including Ben Hodges, what would be the U.S.'s response? And given that all of them sort of respond almost the same thing every time I ask, it makes me think that it's sort of an old contingency plan that they're repeating. And that is that the U.S. would strike to destroy all the Russian troops inside of Ukraine, all the positions that are there. They would also destroy the Russian military base in Russia that had housed this or had fired this in order to make an example to further other Russian soldiers who would think to use nuclear weapons. The U.S. would sink the Black Sea Fleet. And if necessary, if there was a sign there's going to be escalation from the side of the Russians, the U.S. does have the capability of sinking every Russian nuclear submarine within an hour. They'd all be gone forever. I mean, there'd be no more Russian Navy. So I don't think Russia really has a lot to gain in this. Once again, if we're going down to military, we can turn off electricity to Russia whenever we want to. And we can make things go very, very dark for them in many, many ways. We've chosen not to. I mean, just recently we're passing more sanctions. It's incredible. Why we're 3 years later finding new things to sanction? We didn't know about this before? No. I mean, I'll give you an incredible example. The Biden administration realized that there is a specific place from which all the cotton comes from that is used in order to produce various things for the weaponry of Russia. They had the ability to buy up all that cotton supply. I want to say it wasn't a lot. It was $6 million, $9 million. And if they bought that, the Russians would have been unable to then produce more. They chose not to because they thought that would create more problems to the Russians. I personally worked on a case where we found that all the lubricants for engines and motors in Russia, the lubricant itself is coming, well, not the lubricant itself, but rather there's a chemical that's used in the lubricant that comes from 2 factories in China, and there's 1 factory in France. So I thought, well, this would be very easy to get the Americans to put pressure on the French. And on the Chinese, we could definitely cut a deal and all stop. The White House was totally opposed to sanctioning this element being sold to Russia. Why? The White House people with whom I spoke said, but, normal civilians in Russia use engines too. It's not fair to them. And I said, but we could stop the war. In the estimate, I think it was like 9 days, 12 days, the war would be over. It's 2022. So that's an escalation. We can't escalate that much. And I said, this is just absurd. We don't want to win. We're so obviously not interested in winning here. But it goes on and on like this. It never ends. So was there a threat of nuclear war? No. I mean, nuclear war? No, absolutely not. Was there a threat of them blowing up something in the middle of a field that's less than a hectare of land? Yeah, I mean, that could happen. But why should we change what we're doing because of that? Russia has far more to lose if we destroy their navy than they have to gain.
That's the key point. The loss of a hectare of land or the impact, even if you were to consider that there might be a zone fully irradiated somewhere in the middle of Ukraine. Ukraine already has one zone like that with Chernobyl, which, by the way, is the consequence of very, very bad Russian maintenance, negligence, and willful misconduct. Ukraine can deal with these things. it is the Western Europeans who, thanks to propaganda, which, shall we say, the party which has just been voted out of the government has been propagated and made mainstream in Germany, meaning the Greens, has been dealing with. And this fear, we're back to fear of war, peace, that one argument of yours, Konrad, this fear which the Russians exploit existed in the White House. And it still even exists in this White House. You can hear it. Mr. Trump constantly says, he said it yesterday when Macron was correcting him, that it could lead to World War III. Well, okay, so he has a different kind of chronology than you have, Jason, but still. And then Mr. Witkoff, who evidently is very happy to deal with the devil if necessary, and has absolutely no understanding of history or warfare for that matter, is trying to highlight now that there are fantastic deals in Krasnoyarsk. Mr. Witkoff has never, ever set foot in Krasnoyarsk, and if I were to recommend it to him, he would probably have to. It's just, these are comments by people who follow in the footsteps of Chamberlain, and even for that, their feet are too small.
So let me just ask further questions. Jason, you said the Americans could sink every single Russian nuclear submarine within just a click of a finger.
Within 45 minutes, I think it is, to be exact.
Right.
Yeah. But that was always the case, Konrad. We've been tracking and tracing them always.
That's not new.
Like that America is now heading, is not evil. It's heading in a different direction. We always thought, or I thought for some time, that the Kellogg formula might become the guideline of Trump's approach. Say, put maximum pressure on Ukraine, which I dislike, but also put maximum pressure on Russia, which I would like. And now we see that it's something different. I don't see Putin even wanting to. I don't see Trump even wanting to do all those things that you described, destroying the Black Sea Fleet, sinking the submarines, basically retaliating. I wonder whether the will is there after I saw that this two-sided approach of General Kellogg has changed into something different. Or am I wrong?
Well, listen, it's very hard to predict what Donald Trump's going to do next. And so I don't wish to guess because nobody knows. And let's be honest, I don't think that he really knows. So it would be very hard to predict. But that being said, at the same time, I think that it's very clear that he believes, or his team believes, that the Russians don't want to negotiate. They were concerned by that because the overtures they made towards Russia are just so over the top. It's so crazy. It's so insane. I can't imagine that's being done because apparently he loves to negotiate. Why would you give away all your cards before you get to the negotiating table?
Exactly.
What I think is more the alarming part, and I think is probably where we are realistically, is that he is most interested in how they can get a peace deal. He doesn't care what it looks like, if it's a good or bad peace deal. They just want a peace deal. And they sincerely believe he'll win the Nobel Prize for Peace for this. So, because that is their obsession, and once again, we should always address what is the motivation to try to understand what the actions are. If your motivation is a deal, any deal, doesn't matter how bad it is for Ukraine, good it is for Russia, I just got a deal, and so now I deserve a Nobel Peace Prize. If that's the total logic, which I think it is, then it's very simple to understand. Yeah, I mean, it looks like it's going to help Russia, or he's doing it to at least entice them to begin negotiations. But it's I think, quite shallow. And hopefully, and I think that actually after last Wednesday, specifically when Donald Trump started to attack Zelensky publicly and this whole ensuing disaster, following that, we did see a couple of things happen that were positive, including the fact that Kellogg in Kiev referred to Zelensky as being a great president and a hero. Now, keep in mind, he said that after Trump had said that he wasn't the president. So why did he do that? Why did they cancel the press conference with Kellogg and Zelensky? And I think the reality of the reason is the White House had decided that was a mistake. They went too far on the Zelensky thing and had to reverse back.
And they have been quieter in recent days. And yesterday they got a couple of corrections from Macron.
Yeah. It sounds, and there's a reason.
Yeah, okay. of the current administration, and the people who are driving that, ideologically, whatever else, is toxic. It is very unhelpful. And the consequences are vast. Galveston wrote about this a few hours ago in the Wall Street Journal. I liked what he said, but he summarized stuff which Jason and I have been discussing with you as well for quite some time. But the interesting thing is really that soon, Senate Majority Leader Tillis, who just came back as a senator from this Cordell visit to Ukraine surrounding the security conference, Don Bacon, who we had on our show, and who has always been a centrist Republican, but also he is an Air Force general. I mean, he's a really good guy. Fitzpatrick, everybody has highlighted that it's Russia is the aggressor. Putin conducted genocide. We should not forget who's who. The Trump administration, nevertheless, the only thing which they've really done really, really nasty in recent days, because Macron came in between, is this UN resolution stuff, which from a symbolic part matters more to the Europeans because they are so attached to the UN. But on the other hand, it also matters to the Americans because the Republicans were extremely proud. I do remember those days when Nikki Haley lifted her arm and voted against. And this was both the Israel resolution as well as one which at that point in time went against the genocide supported by Russia. So Nikki Haley was a different kind of beast at that time, and she was not necessarily always in agreement with him. And this is the first Trump administration where he had many people in the administration he didn't like. Okay, fine, fair enough. But still, the Republicans were, and the whole conservative press was super proud of her. That has changed. And this model of media affinity, you can hear when Ms. Levitt is on the podium today, for example, in the press conference, where she's very proud to have people like Semaphore who are sponsored by the People's Republic of China's Communist Party. I mean, they may sit in California, but they're sponsored by these guys. And she's happy to invite them and say, it's good that we have other media choices. Well, maybe do your research. Oh, you've done it, but you still invited them. That's the bad part of it.
So if that's true, let's suppose that you're right, and I'm maybe too pessimistic about America, and if it is, as you said, Jason, that the cancellation of the press conference of Kellogg and Zelensky was because Washington, the administration might have changed its mind, and they might have revisited the branding of Zelensky as a dictator. So the question is now, is there anything that European leaders, European countries can do to support this change of mind if it actually happens? Because, of course, if it should be true, we should not lose the opportunity. So what can we do to support this?
The reality is, I think we have to understand the context that all this is being driven by one person's ego. So if he believes that what he's doing makes him look like a hero, or that he's winning, or if Europeans give him the impression that they've really seen the way that he sees things now, it sounds very juvenile to recommend this. But the fact is that flattery does work with him. It's quite clear.
The Macron approach.
So it's
Macron did now in Washington.
Yes, well, and Starmer's going to be there next week. But the thing is that I think that what we should look ahead for is that on the case of, so Donald Trump, if we look back at him historically, there's a couple of things that I'll cite that are probably worth keeping in mind for the next 4 years, because it'll make life a little bit easier to bear, is that one, whenever he does something really outlandish, like really crazy, it's usually because he's trying to cover up a bad press story. So you remember when he was doing his press conference about Greenland being taken over a couple weeks ago? Well, why was that? Because a federal court in New York was coming out saying that he was guilty of various things. So there's a reason he just went on this press conference that was top news, BBC, CNN, Fox News. It was him live speaking for 2.5 hours, mumbling about Greenland, a country that Americans don't know where it's located. And why? It's because nobody talked about him being found guilty. This is not the first time.
Look at the shiny thing. Look at the shiny thing.
It's no way. When he's president the first time, we did the exact same thing. When I was, I remember very clearly in 2015, in the campaign, the Republican primaries, Ted Cruz, who was the one U.S. Senator Republican who was competing with him, had a very good chance at winning the primaries. And it was determined that if he came out with a strong economic program, he would beat Trump. And sure enough, at 8 a.m. on a Tuesday, Cruz was getting this massive press conference. All the press in the world is there, and he's going to explain how the U.S. economy is going to become, the greatest than ever. And sure enough, at 7:55 in the morning, Donald Trump starts tweeting that Ted Cruz's father killed Kennedy. Obviously, he doesn't believe this. Cruz's father's from Cuba, but guess what? What do you think the news wrote about? Do you think one journalist bothered to ask about the economic program? Not one. 100% of the questions, why did your father kill Kennedy? What do you think that Donald Trump says your father killed Kennedy? So this is a tactic. Don't think further than to understand it's a tactic. So that's first. But the second thing I will say about foreign policy for him, I see no interest for anything he's ever done that he has a sincere interest in foreign policy. I think he really likes Israel, or at least he understands that that's what his base likes, so he likes it. But it goes back to the original point, which is everything he does is for his own ego. So he doesn't do things that make him unpopular. He only does things that will make him more popular. A short-term thing, talk about taking the Panama Canal or Greenland for a couple of days, or Canada becoming the 51st state. It's not going to hurt you really with your population. It totally distracts the press, but it doesn't hurt you. No voter in America cares. And so when he does stuff like says, Zelensky's a dictator, that sort of, juvenile tit for tat sort of response from him, which is typical. But then I think he realized, the reaction to this isn't as nearly as positive as hoping, or, people really frown on that because now my senators are getting upset. So he doesn't repeat it because it doesn't help him. It doesn't make him feel strong. It doesn't make him feel powerful. And so he doesn't do it anymore.
Okay, so I understand the answer to the question, how shall we, if there is this opportunity that you're talking about, if all this is not, needs to be taken literally, all these provocations, then you say, maybe I over-exaggerate your statement, flatter his ego. Shouldn't we also try to play a little bit of hardball? And can we?
Absolutely.
Can we play hardball?
Sugar and spice. Yes, you need to give both. And the good thing is we are lucky. They scold us, and they in the administration as Europeans, and we're so heterogeneous and we have so many voices. That's perfect. Think about it. Meloni has one specific track with him, which works for her. I don't even want to go into much detail. We could talk 2 hours about it, and not all of it is appetizing. Macron has one specific track, and he built on this after he had initially a very acrimonious falling out with him. But he did this, and he fixed it because he found ways to go for the bling and for the enjoyment, as Jason said, the shallow luxury approach, whining and dining in the capital of Paris and all that. He did this, and he does it nice, and he does it flattery nice, but he does it also with the same level of condescension, and Trump feels that. You can watch it in his interviews. It is evident. It's so visible, body language-wise, and the way he also says it that thereafter. He didn't like how he was treated by Macron at the end of the Q&A, and when everybody was sitting there, and Marco Rubio was sitting there in front of him, and everybody else and nodding. He didn't like that for one thing, because Macron was running the show. That's interesting. So if Friedrich Merz, the problem is that we have someone who's not a very good communicator in Britain at the moment. Mr. Starmer is in that regard really, unhelpful. Mr. Merz is very dry, but also very sincere. And I'd say if you play this right in this quadriga of the four leaders of the larger countries, then you can play it well. The person who really needs to find a way to express herself in that regard is Miss von der Leyen, because whilst she is otherwise a reasonably adept communicator, she speaks perfect languages and everything, and she can argue, she has never found a way to communicate with Mr. Trump. And that's really bad, because the EU, as the, so to say, economic organization, and the ones he has to deal with in terms of tariffs, he just found this out last week, by the way, that the EU as an organization deals with the tariffs with one voice and one voice only. He was not quite sure about it, interesting enough. I mean,
he didn't remember for his last term.
Well, in his last term, he tried it. Don't forget, he tried to differentiate the Italians and their naval exports and their industries from everybody else. He tried it with the French, and to an extent, he nearly won the French over because of their territoire d'outre-mer and some exemptions. He tried it with the EEA by trying to entertain, some deals with the Norwegians who were not quite in and not quite out. And at that point in time, don't forget, also in this first term, Sweden and Finland were not in NATO. So he treated them differently despite the fact that they were part of the EU. So there were various different things. The deal which, for example, Kongsberg had then with Raytheon, that was very meticulously planned by Lighthizer at that point in time, who was significantly more important in the trade administration. And people in Europe didn't know what hit them because they were not well prepared. Lighthizer is a man of details. Now, Lighthizer is not in charge. It's Navarro. Navarro is much more biased, much more narrow, doesn't have all the articles at hand. So they are not as adept at executing that as they could have been and were last time, which fits within the shallow, biased approach Jason was highlighting. This is the interesting part of it. So if you think about it, Ms. von der Leyen has a big chance. That's why I'm highlighting it. I think there's a great opportunity. It shouldn't be wasted. So it shouldn't be just 4 leaders. It should be 5, if possible.
And I think you are particularly right because the leverage that we have as partners is being the biggest, as the European Union, the biggest investor in the United States, and also I think the biggest importer of American exports.
We were. I'm not sure whether we were. We've been it last year, but definitely we were
quite big as investors and as customers. So we have some leverage. Also, our relationships to China can be leverage. Actually, Trump, if he follows up on his threats, he drives us into the arms of China, which is an element of leverage that we as Europeans have willy-nilly, not because I like China, but because we will have to side with China if we want to defend ourselves against a tariff war that Trump might impose on us. Not because I like that, but because just a thought about China and America. In the German doctrine, the doctrine of the Scholz government, China was categorized with 3 words: partner, competitor, and systemic rival. And we had China has with these 3 attributes. We had the ally America and the enemy Russia. And now the situation has changed. We have basically 2 big powers who can be categorized as partner, competitor, and systemic rival, which is the US and China. We have one enemy and we don't have an ally anymore.
See, this is a good point, but in the short, this is the classic analysis. Many people are constantly projecting in the German government at that time. But which one nation are they leaving out all the time? The single largest democracy in the world. Everybody in Germany fails to deal with India. They completely fail. This is astonishing. Nobody should be driven into the hands or into the arms of China where there are no property rights. Not saying that India is perfect, but at least it has a proper, sensible common law system. It has a significantly higher educated population than China on average. The Chinese may have state-run universities, and India does not want to attack us or anyone, and they're not attacking Taiwan.
On the long term, you're right. Is India already now? Oh, what's the GDP of India? Is it something like 1.5 trillion, or what is the GDP of India? It's less than Germany. It's less than Germany.
But it's closing in. It's closing in.
Germany is at about 4 trillion, I think. So India should be something.
3.6. They're at 3.6 in 2023. So they're closing in on us.
So, and China is at 30 always. Where is China? Or 70?
Oh no, China is more. China, hold on. God, I should have known this before. I apologize for being unprepared, but I can get you that.
Let's not stick
You're
to
right.
numbers.
It's 18.1 now.
India is a perspective partner, but we need solutions now. Because now we are in the zone of risk. So yes, nothing against India. I don't know very much about that country, so I understand that that this is one of those countries that are coming up. But I was starting from what shall we do at the moment.
I think that the position in that regard is clear. One should open up significantly more to India and make it bilateral in order to tie India, which has been unfortunately falling prey to a lot of Russian propaganda due to its long-term affiliation with it. And it has also unfortunately taken relatively, shall we say, pro-Russian steps for sanctions evasion. But you should engage with India a lot more, given the fact that it actually has a perspective to remain a heterogeneous democracy with a substantial capability to build out in information technology. It's important for logistics. It's strategically important. It has agriculture. India has pretty much everything a little bit, but it has also a vast domestic market to cater to. And a domestic market which is open to product and high quality product, which can be manufactured both in Europe as well as in India. So in terms of property rights and capital, say in wealth accumulation, India is maybe a harder market to deal with because it is, as I said, heterogeneous. The Germans have, and I had this discussion once when friends of mine and colleagues from Deutsche Messe AG reported back after having their Shanghai adventure being built out, where Shanghai, the expo was, but they were together with Dusseldorf and everybody else building it out. They were unhappy that there was a massive delay. They highlighted to the corresponding general on the other side that they were unhappy about that delay. And the Chinese were, I don't know how many months, 9 or 10 months, something. I can't remember the exact details. But they were many months behind schedule. This was highlighted. The level of shame and humiliation which was vested in this was seemingly massive. And then within a few days, the Chinese had sent literally a full brigade of construction soldiers from their armed forces there and added more to it in order to make up by means of manual labor for the delays they had in foundation works and whatnot. This authoritarian approach, some of the people who saw it were astonished by it, and they said, oh, they can do everything. This reminded me of the reports of Walter Duranty on Russian agriculture in 1930-32, at the tail end of the Holodomor, and the reports by Henry Ford, which he made on the National Socialist German Reichsarbeitsdienst and building motorways and ports and infrastructure. They were all so excited about what could be achieved. But then again, these are authoritarian build-outs. And this is the real issue, this excitement. And you can sense this a little bit in the Trump administration. They're so excited that a big deal can be done with someone who has, influence. We should never be excited about the authoritarians. Governments have partially adopted that model.
And you might be also right that the parallel to the Reichsarbeitsdienst and the Stalinist industrialization of the 30s was that what these efforts actually led to was a failing system.
Yes.
Germany didn't have the opportunity to fail economically because it chose another way to fail.
Yeah.
But the Soviet Union failed at the end economically because this path didn't lead to the results. And I'm not a prophet, but I think that China, having left the Deng Xiaoping path of giving people economic freedom and a certain degree of personal freedom, might have chosen a path to decline, which might take long time, as it took with the Soviet Union. So it's not something imminent for the next 5 or 6 years. But I think China having abandoned the formula that made it great during since the 90s might have made a great mistake. And but let's come back maybe to sum up what after the election in Germany, what I think a German government should focus on.
Alrighty, so this was part 1 of today's discussion about the German election and how it matters to the defense of freedom of Europe and Ukraine, where Konrad Schuller from the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung and Jason J. Smart of Ep6 were with me here discussing it in quite some detail and with a bit of historic background, breadth, and intensity. Whereas in the second part, after the departure of Jason, Konrad and I went further into the depths of German politics and the election itself, which you may find worthwhile watching in part 2. Thank you.